Shalom, family. It's good to see you all here. I'm glad you're here. I know, I didn't give much time for this live stream, but that's okay. Anybody that's not here can always go back and watch it. And, there are some updates, and I think updates that you really need to hear. I know many of us have noticed the inflation, and there's been a few things here and there going down, but housing is definitely not going down at all. And there are many people that believe the US dollar has also, already sustained damage, and that's going to grow. So I wanted to get a recap of what happened during the summit, especially the things that are going to impact the US dollar. And you're going to be, I don't think surprised, but I think it will be interesting the kind of moves that they made during this summit. If of you were not aware, the US tried to break this summit up, but they just couldn't do it. So, what are the things that happened? Well, they took in new membership, and the membership that joined during the summit is huge. All right. So the nations that joined during the 2-day summit was Saudi Arabia, Iran, Ethiopia, Egypt, Argentina, and UAE. Now, the two that are the biggest is Saudi Arabia and UAE. All right. They just joined. This is huge because you got two oil giants right there that are part of BRICS now. And it's not just that. If you remember, before the BRICS summit, it was like a few days before the BRICS summit, India purchased 1 million barrels of oil with rupees. It is the first time they ever did that. They always purchase with US dollars. And in fact, the entire globe always purchased their oil with US dollars. So I knew something was going on with India because when they paid in rupees, I knew something big was coming on the horizon, but I wasn't sure what it was. Volcanus, thank you so much for the super sticker. All right. Saudi Arabia and UAE is going to allow all BRICS nations to purchase their oil in their country's currency and not the US dollar. Now, you may think, okay, that is huge. That is huge. These nations, all the way up until now, use US dollar to purchase all of their oil. They're now opening the door. Saudi Arabia and UAE is now opening the door for people to pay in their own country's currency and not the US dollar. Now, many of you already know the relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia went sour probably about 10 to 12 years ago, and it has not been the same since. They have not been able to come back together. And I think it's safe to say it is just not going to happen. All right. So that's huge. So, a lot of times when Vladimir Putin said during the Ukraine war, anybody that helped Ukraine, he was going to, you know, give retribution to those nations. And some people were under the impression, oh, well, Russia may drop bombs. No, you don't have to drop a bomb to take down a nation. You don't. You don't have to drop one single bomb to do that. So instead of going the military route, they're going the financial route. That's what they're doing. And another really important thing I found out about the summit is, you know how America went around and put sanctions on certain countries? I had no idea. America put sanctions on one third of the globe. That's how many nations they put sanctions on. And guess what the BRICS nations are made of? The BRICS nations are all nations that the US put sanctions on. Those nations are now turning on them and joining BRICS. All of these nations that you see joining BRICS had sanctions put on them by the US. And now all those nations are turning. One third of the earth had US sanctions. Boy, they just got carried away. But see, they didn't anticipate those nations turning on them. But that's exactly what's happening. And BRICS also said they are opening the door for more countries to join them. So they grew during the summit. But I think Saudi and the UAE, two oil giants, oh yeah, that's a huge black eye to America. And see, that is going to be a huge impact. Remember, we're coming into fall and winter where countries are looking to make sure they have enough oil to supply energy to their citizens. So without them using that US dollar, man, they're going to feel the pain in the West. They are going to feel the pain. And it's not really India. If you really think back, it was Russia that kicked this whole thing off. If you remember in the beginning of the war, the US was piling on the sanctions on them, just piling it on. And Russia, remember, supplies a good amount of the world with their gas and oil. And if you remember, Putin wanted them to pay in rubles. Y'all remember that? That's really where it kicked off. If they wanted to purchase from Russia, they had to pay in rubles. And that is really what kicked off the whole thing. About now, you're going to see more nations making purchases without that US dollar. So I think this is going to be the beginning, and it's just going to snowball from there. Hmm. Exactly, J Zero. They did a hit and assassinated the US without firing one single shot. They killed the bill, petrodollar bill. LOL. You're right. You're right. You know, and unfortunately, when you listen to some of the commentary, America is still trying to put on airs like, oh, we're going to be fine. They're not going to be fine, y'all. That is a huge blow because if they're not using your currency to buy gas and oil, then that means that's less money coming to your economy. And if it's less money coming to the economy, then you're going to pass that on to your citizens. And there's only so much hiking up you can do to your citizens. And Denise, thank you so much for bringing up Ukraine. Another thing that came up was in a recent poll, American citizens are getting real tired of Joe Biden supplying all the money and military gear and everything to Ukraine. It's saying that more and more Americans are not in support of it. And you know, Joe Biden, he wants to shove everything over to Ukraine, but the citizens here in need, he don't want to do nothing for. And that's a problem. But a lot of people are now growing tired of that. And you know, Biden, I don't think Biden's going to stop doing it. In fact, he did it recently. He sent more money and aid over to Ukraine. And it wasn't but what, a week or two ago, they're talking about sending F-16s over there. But if you also look at the stories coming out, Ukraine really don't have much of an army anymore. Their army got wiped out. I don't know how many of you have heard those things coming out from Ukraine. Their whole army is depleted. So, there is just no winning for them. How do you win when you have suffered those kinds of losses? So you're shoving all this money and military equipment over there, and they really don't have much of a military anymore. I don't know. So what is the money being used for really at this point if he don't really have too many soldiers? I mean, then what's going on with the money? I'm just saying they're not doing well at all. And I was looking at some of the recent stories coming out of Ukraine. They're really doing bad over there. There is no glimmer of hope for them. It is really looking bad. But there are some people that are still out here pushing the propaganda that they're doing fine and they're pushing hard against Russia. How much hard pushing can you do and you don't have much of an army anymore? I mean, come on, that's just fantasy talk at this point. So I'm going to play some of this commentary that I have, and this is the audio. And I may stop in between to do some commentary. All right. Can everybody see my screen? Please give me a 1 if you can see the screen before I even get started. Give me a 1 if you can see the screen. Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. All right.
Countries of BRICS, a growing non-Western economic collective, are meeting for their 15th annual summit in South Africa this week with a big announcement. 5 new member countries have been added to the current bloc: Egypt, Ethiopia, Argentina, the UAE, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. They join current members Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now, at the summit, leaders from member countries discussed de-dollarization, Western global hegemony, and moving toward a multipolar world.
In a thinly veiled statement, Chinese President Xi Jinping wrote, quote, "One country obsessed with maintaining its hegemony has gone out of its way to cripple the emerging markets in developing countries. Whoever is developing fast becomes its target of containment. Whoever is catching up becomes its target of obstruction. But this is futile. As I have said more than once, that blowing out others' lamp will not bring light to oneself." Joining us now to weigh in is editor at The Gray Zone, Max Blumenthal. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, this feels like a really significant global shift, and an end, as people are saying, to Western hegemony that many people predicted as we headed into this Ukraine proxy war, China becoming more closely aligned with Russia, and this this growth of this economic alliance that's meant to counterbalance Western hegemony and economic dominance seems to be really telling. Help us understand what's at stake here.
Well, this is the most historic gathering of the BRICS, which was founded in 2009 to democratize international trade and international institutions by fostering multipolarity, countering the bipolar, unipolar world that's emerged since the collapse of the Soviet Union, which has brought on disaster for the global South, as well as unchecked violations of international law through coalitions of the willing, as we've seen in Iraq and beyond. The BRICS aims to foster trade through a new development bank, as it's called, and this could potentially upend the hegemony, the domination of the dollar, particularly if states like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which provide the basis for the petrodollar, which is itself the foundation of dollar hegemony, if they join and begin trading in local currency. For example, Saudi Arabia is discussing trading or selling oil to China in renminbi, which would break the dominance of the petrodollar. So the reason this gathering is so historic is because BRICS is actually talking about expanding and has pledged to expand to some very significant countries, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. But of course, expansion can bring a lot of political complication.
The U.S. has been trying to flex its influence all over the world for so long. We've spent so much money. We're spending so much money right now in Ukraine, the projects in the Middle East, the bases everywhere, on and on and on. Do you think the American people might feel at some point cheated by their government that so much money of this money has been spent and you might say that was not a good idea to do this in the first place, but we did do it, and yet we did not. Our influence is in decline, despite how much effort and how many resources we've exhausted to remain, the top country, the top government in the world.
Well, our correspondent Anya Parampil is in Johannesburg covering the BRICS right now, and one thing she's noticed at a conference which mostly pertains to the nations of the global South, especially the non-aligned nations that didn't line up with the Soviet Union or the US during the Cold War and which seek to fight for their independence, is the presence of many Americans as well as British reporters from places like The Economist. What are they doing there? Well, they sort of represent the interests of the G7, which is often posited as the dominant sphere of economic sphere, and they're threatened by what's happening at BRICS because of the prospect of de-dollarization, which is the dollar hegemony is the basis for US financial sanctions, which are administered unilaterally, not through the UN, to destroy the economies and the people of countries from Syria to Venezuela to Cuba to countries like Eritrea, which is kind of the Cuba of Africa and has resisted IMF loans, taken its own line. And what the US has done by actually sanctioning 1/3 of the world's population, think about that, is created a backlash where these countries are now gathering together and figuring out how they can conduct trade and break away from the dollar. And you've heard that expressed in the president's roundtable today that was held and convened by UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres from Venezuela, for example, or from Eritrea, about the unfairness of global relations with the dollar dominating all trade and their desire to break it. They're not hiding their agenda right now. However, there are other nations like Brazil, which have feared expansion of the BRICS because they don't want to come to loggerheads with the US. And Brazil has only agreed to allow Argentina in at this point. But the desire is there, the possibilities are there, and the US is making it almost impossible for many of these countries to operate within the Bretton Woods system and not be financially immiserated.
So I think what's really important, if you want folks to really understand what's going on here, is to get at the root of what Xi Jinping was saying in the quote that we read at the top. This idea that this isn't conspiracy, this isn't just, our quote unquote enemy talking, but that it has been an explicit harshly inflicted policy of the United States of America to maintain global dominance by actively suppressing other countries as they grow and develop, either through sanctions, as you pointed out, with 1/3 of the world's people being sanctioned, or through other kind of economic tools like the IMF. But I do think sometimes we skip over how exactly something like the IMF, which many people understand is just, a good thing that gives money to governments so that they can grow. And are we just being charitable? I mean, how do all of those global organizations, those financial organizations, act as a tool of the government in this way? And therefore, and how does that help us understand why this BRICS alliance and the growth of the BRICS alliance is so important to shaking off the shackles of U.S. control, economic control?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that's the point of the new development bank, is to give out loans that are favorable to countries who do not want to have to meet the political conditions that the United States and its transatlantic partners mete out and impose on them. So we can look at what's happening in Argentina right now. After years and years of austerity imposed by the IMF because their reserves are dried up and they're experiencing hyperinflation, the country's shifting right. And the front runner in their election is Javier Milei, who's a right-wing libertarian, which may actually complicate their BRICS membership as well as Latin American cooperation. Or we can think of this in light of the Hunter Biden scandal and what the IMF, how the US uses the IMF even against supposed allies. Joe Biden, when his son was on the Burisma board, went to Kiev and threatened them with an IMF loan, showing how the US can control the IMF, and said, you will not receive this loan unless you, quote, reform your judiciary, fire the prosecutor, and do everything that might have been needed to protect Burisma from prosecution. So it actually fostered more corruption in Ukraine. And then once they got the loan, they had to meet all these austerity conditions, which have doomed the Ukrainian population, particularly Ukrainian workers, sold off their land. And so BRICS is presenting an alternative, and it's also politically significant that Russia and China are able to break through the attempts to isolate them, or in Joe Biden's words, reduce the ruble to rubble. Vladimir Putin, in his address to BRICS, pledged to actually supplant Ukraine as a global grain supplier to Africa and promised tons and tons of free grain to Africa. All
right, did y'all hear that? Putin has control over Ukraine's grain. And he is saying he's going to give all of that grain from Ukraine and give it all to Africa for free. That's what Putin said he's going to do. And Ukraine, they depended on that grain, for a lot of their for their economy. They got their economy from their grain and from other things that they would sell to the world. Well, Putin got control of it now. And he said he's going to take that grain and give all of it to Africa for free. And he made that pledge at the BRICS summit. I mean, that's deep. Let me go on.
Africa has experienced the brunt of the Ukraine proxy war and US sanctions and complications of grain exports. And so this is massive for Africa. And then we can look at what's happening inside Africa in the Sahel region, where you have these popular coups overthrowing governments that had been tools of the West, particularly Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, particularly tools of France. And Niger is following on the foothills of this multipolar development by starting a new company to not just export tomatoes and then import tomato paste, but to actually produce tomato-based products and to industrialize their gold production, which right now consists of a lot of youth in informal artisanal mines holding out pans in water. This is a massive development that will have a ricochet effect throughout the African continent.
Yeah, that's such an important point. I just did a deep dive on Niger on my own podcast recently. I was really shocked by an expert who was explaining the extent to which all of those countries in the so-called post-colonial era were very much still subject to control of by France through their currency, and have been victims of a highly extractive relationship with France throughout, and had intentionally their infrastructure and their development thwarted, while China's approach has been to build stadiums and infrastructure. And that's part of why it's been so dominant. One last question that I had for you, though, is the American public, since the end of the Cold War, has been convinced that America's efforts to maintain global dominance are in the interest of the American people. There was the domino theory and the broad public investment in the idea that you had to beat the Soviets, got to beat them to the moon, you got to beat them around the world. It justified any number of wars, Vietnam, et cetera, stopping the expansion of communism. Is something changing now, or are we still in a situation where the idea of other global powers emerging, namely China, is being used by people to beat the drum of war? And if that's the case, how should Americans think about the decline of American dominance globally? Are they wrong to think that it will negatively impact their standards of living? And why should they think differently about perhaps a kind of global solidarity?
Well, we're looking at the decline of American hegemony, but this doesn't necessarily mean that the U.S. is experiencing an economic decline.
See, that's where I disagree with him. And see, this is where you got to take what these folks say with a grain of salt. And this is why I'm saying this. This country has not bounced back economically since the pandemic. The 2019 level that they were at then, they have still not been able to achieve. So when they talk, so you got to kind of take, the economists with a grain of salt, because they're going to try to put on airs and act like, oh, well, we're, economically, we're not that bad. We're doing pretty good. We're strong. No, we're not. No, we're not. America has never gotten that back, and they know it. But in my opinion, that's all propaganda talk, that they're all in denial. And as for France, France's position is getting weak over in Africa. They don't have it like they used to. A lot of those African nations are kicking them out, or just saying, look, we want you to leave. So it's not the same over there for France anymore. And I think that it's going to change more and more, especially as the BRICS nation rise. America's never going to do anything about what France does over there, but I think these BRICS nations will. I think they will make a difference and keep France from out of there exploiting those countries over in Africa. But let's go on.
Economy is completely financialized and based on artificially backed currency. But the U.S. has the means to do what other countries are doing to fuel its own development if it actually sought to do it, if it wasn't selling off its industrial base at the whims of corporations. But that's just not the reality that we've been living in. And I just think many Americans, actually most Americans now, oppose aid to Ukraine. They don't accept this argument that sending aid there is actually beneficial to Americans in any way, because they experienced what Biden falsely called the Putin price hike, which was actually the NATO price hike. By electing to sanction Russia, the U.S. was no longer able to offset the oil that it refused to import from Iran and Venezuela and other oil producers because of political sanctions on those countries. So Americans need to understand how their government sanctions have a boomerang effect at home. They're not going to experience it as strongly as Europeans or Africans for that matter, but they're beginning to get the picture. And we see it even playing out in the Republican debates. Vivek Ramaswamy, who's just basically a proxy for Trump on so many positions, he successfully exposed the gulf between the Republican corporate elite and the Republican base on Ukraine, which understands that this war, it doesn't benefit it. and used it to break through in the debate, while the rest of the candidates took the George W. Bush position, which has been discredited. There's no candidate putting forward that line within the Democratic Party, but it will be exposed further throughout this campaign that Americans understand they don't benefit from this so-called rules-based order in which the U.S. seeks to make the rules and everybody else has to follow its orders. Americans would like to have friendly trade relations too, to benefit their economic future.
Yeah. Okay. So that's pretty much the gist of the things they were talking about at the summit. So, this, them just throwing away the dollar, I believe it's going to become strong this coming winter. I really do. And countries have to replenish their supplies. And when they do, they're going to be using their own currency. And that is going to make a huge difference on the impact of the dollar. So that's my expectation. That's what I walk away with, is as we move forward, especially as we get into the winter months, the dollar is going to steadily get weaker because it won't be used as much. So, y'all, that's all I wanted to do, was just update you on this, because that's what I was waiting for. I was waiting for the end of the summit to find out exactly what was said and how it's going to impact the U.S. And boy, is it going to impact the U.S. big time. But I don't think anybody should be surprised. We knew this was coming. Yeah, there's a lot going on with Niger these days. That place has been in ruins since France have been dominating them. And you can't rise when you have these Gentiles running things. They want everything to stay in place so they can continue to thrive at the top. And we know that's all coming to an end, whether they like it or not. It is. Their rise was temporary. It was never permanent. And what would they stay on top based on anyway? Their whole foundation is based on lies. How would they stay at the top forever? They couldn't. And plus, don't you have to reproduce as a people in order to keep yourself strong? And if you're not reproducing, how are you going to do that? So, they got more working against them than for them these days. So, everybody, thank you so much for being here. And, hopefully you will all return for my next live stream that will start at 1:00. So I hope to see each and every one of you there. And please enjoy the rest of your day. And don't forget to watch the videos that I posted. Peace, family.